So this is, can everyone hear me all right? Is that good? Make sure I do that right. Cool. So this is Kaiju Video Games History, what did I call it? The Revenge. This is part 3. Not that you need to have seen the other 2 panels, but I'll explain that in a little bit. So a little bit about myself. I'm Alex Rushdie. I'm a lifelong Kaiju fan and a lifelong video game fan. So I've kind of made it my goal to find and catalog every single Kaiju video game that exists. And you can check out my progress on this on my blog, controlallmonsters.com. I also run Seismic Toys. We're in the dealer's room. We're a designer toy company and a toy store. And I'm CEO at 13am Games, which is probably the most relevant. I've been in the game industry for a while. So this is actually the 3rd panel in a series of panels I've been doing since 2019. And if you want to check out the previous panels, I've uploaded them to my YouTube channel, Control All Monsters. And I'll be recording this one as well, assuming technology doesn't fail me here. So a little bit about myself. I've been in the game industry for 9 years now. My studio, 13am Games, our first game was called Runbow, and then we released Pirate Pop Plus and Double Cross, and then last year we released Dawn of the Monsters. So that's a Kaiju video game that's on Switch, PS4, PS5, PC, and a bunch of other platforms. And shameless plug, you can now buy the physical copy in the dealer's room. So if you missed out on it, now's your chance to pick it up. So the reason that I did this panel in the first place was because I would hear a lot of times that, people would complain there weren't enough Kaiju video games. And I kind of found that really weird because in my experience, you couldn't be farther from the truth. There are way too many Kaiju video games. There's so many, and they're across every genre that's out there. There aren't just fighting games. There aren't just strategy games. There's a genre you can think of it. And there are also, a lot of them are not just quite good, but also quite important to video game history. Like, for example, Nintendo got into a pretty famous lawsuit with Universal because Donkey Kong was essentially a King Kong video game, and Universal thought that they were owed some money on that. Thankfully, Universal lost that lawsuit. And a little bit about some of the terms I'm going to be using in this presentation. So what is the difference between a video game developer and a video game publisher? So a developer is the studio that actually makes the video game, and the publisher is the company that sells it. So similar to books, you have authors. Authors are like developers. They're making the actual stuff. And then book publishers are like video game publishers. They help sell it and distribute it. So when someone says a game is made by Nintendo, that's not really accurate. Okay, who at Nintendo made it? They've got HAL Laboratories make Smash Bros. And EAD makes Mario. Last thing, I don't want to get too into this discussion, but we always have to try to define what is a kaiju. It's a very messy thing. There are lots of debates around that. For me, I'm kind of focused more on aesthetics. If it's a Japanese-inspired giant monster or tokusatsu-inspired thing, I'm going to include it, but I'm also going to include like American or Korean or other foreign monsters as well, just because I think they kind of match up with the same target audience. So even if it's not exclusively Japanese, if it fits, it fits. And defining what is a video game. Basically, if it's a device for play that utilizes a screen and uses electronic components, it's a video game. That being said, I will also talk a little bit about pinball where relevant, because pinball is really fun. And lastly, I will not be covering giant robot games. That could be its own panel. I will not be covering Pokemon and Digimon, even though they are technically kaiju. Those could each have their own panel. And I'm not going to be covering regular-sized tokusatsu, so Super Sentai and Kamen Rider. I'll touch a little bit on it here and there where it's relevant, but for the most part, we're here for big monsters. So first off, I'd like to take a look at, okay, what came out since my last presentation last year. And first, a bit of an unusual game is Kaiju. So Kaiju is a kaiju dating simulator, and that released late last year. So this is about pretty cute and cuddly giant monsters going on dates with each other and seeing if they're compatible. And they do so by like smashing cities and eating trains and stuff like that together. It's pretty cute, it's pretty funny, and It was actually only announced for PC, but it got a release on PC, Switch, PS4, PS5, and Xbox, so it's pretty available. That's pretty cool. Next is Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher. So the Monster Rancher series is one that started in 1997 on the PlayStation 1, and what was unique about it is that it allowed you to raise, train, and battle monsters that you could find by inserting any CD into your PS1. So if you had like a music CD of an album you really liked, you could put that into your PS1, it would read it, and it would generate a monster. So every CD summoned something different and unique. And so that was kind of part of the fun, is finding CDs and figuring out, okay, what do I want to summon today? In 2022, the series came back after like a more than a decade-long hiatus, and it was combined with the Ultraman series to create Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher, which is a modern, updated spin on Monster Rancher that swaps out the usual monsters for monsters from the Ultraman series, so like Gamora, Dada, Baltan, and many more. If you like Monster Rancher, this game is a no-brainer. It's really, really good. If you've never played a Monster Rancher game before, you should know that this is not like Pokemon. It's not about monster collecting. It's instead a little bit more like a Tamagotchi or a Digimon virtual pet. So you kind of raise, train, and take care of one kaiju at a time, and over time you feed them, you put them into tournaments, they battle, they get stronger, all that kind of stuff. It's a pretty addictive formula, I'm warning you though. Once you get the hang of it, it'll easily suck away a lot of your time. The game is available on the Nintendo Switch only. It's on the eShop digitally, and it's also available physically in Asian regions. So if you want a physical copy of the game, you can order it from Japan or from Asia, and it'll have English on the cart. Yeah, there's no problem with that. Next, we got some home console ports of some really cool games. So first off, Terror of Hemasaurus. This is a really fun game. If you're a fan of Rampage, I definitely recommend checking this out. It released on Steam, I think, early last year, and since then it's come out on home consoles, so PlayStation, Xbox, Switch. But a fair warning, the heme in Hemasaurus is for hemoglobin. This is a very bloody game. Even though it looks cute and cuddly, it's pretty gory and destructive, but really, really fun. But if you're a little squeamish, I wouldn't recommend it. And next is Kaiju Wars. So Kaiju Wars came out on PC in early 2022, and since then it's been released on PS4, PS5, Switch, Xbox. So if you have a home console, you can check it out. And it's really cool because it's basically what if Godzilla Wars 2 was like really fun instead of kind of hair-rippingly difficult. Really neat game, really cool graphics. Definitely recommend checking it out. And next, another big thing that happened last year was that Gigabash had its first round of DLC. Hopefully it's first. I mean, I hope they're doing more. And it was Godzilla DLC. So Gigabash came out last year. The DLC came out towards the end of the year in December. And this was really cool because Godzilla hadn't been in a console, like a home console video game, in a long time. It was mostly just mobile games. So, yeah, the DLC comes with Godzilla, Kiryu, Gigan, and Destroya. And, yeah, hopefully we see more Godzilla home console games because it's been a really, really long time. But that wasn't his only home console appearance. We also got earlier this year Shin Kamen Rider Rumble. So this is a game based on the new Shin Kamen Rider movie that just came out. And it's got this kind of 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up style. But over the past few months, they've released DLC for the game that allows you to play as AV Unit 01, Shin Godzilla, and Shin Ultraman. So, yeah, it's pretty cool. You can also get this. This was only released in Japan, but it's pretty import-friendly. And you can get it on the eShop, or you can get a physical copy as well. No, you got a question? Yeah. Yeah, same with Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher. There's an Asia version. So when they release games across like different Asia regions outside of Japan, they'll often include English as the default language because that's a lot of times the default language in those regions. And we got one more. So there's a game called Taiko Drum Master. It's a pretty famous rhythm game. And there's a version on Switch that just released DLC that includes the main theme from Shin Kamen Rider and playable characters, kind of chibi characters of Shin Godzilla, Shin Ultraman, AV Unit 01, and Shin Kamen Rider. Got a question there? Oh, nice. So pretty soon. All right. Well, I got a section at the end for games coming out, but that's nice. Yeah. So one more game is I really want to talk about this one. It's called Vengeful Guardian Moonrider. So if you're a fan of Shinobi or Ninja Gaiden, this is a kind of cyber ninja type of game. It came out earlier this year. Really good reviews, really cool game, beautiful art. But what's important to us is that the game is actually an homage to Keita Amamiya. So if you like Cyber Ninja or Zeiram or Kaider or Kamen Rider J or ZO, it's totally a riff on all that stuff. If you're a fan of that kind of tokusatsu, definitely worth checking out this game. And it's good anyways. Another really cool game that has come out since my last presentation is called Squad 51 versus the Flying Saucers. So what is interesting about this game is that you'll notice the developer is listed as Lumi Arts and Fehora Films. This game it's almost like playing an old 50s B-movie. So the graphics are really, it's supposed to look like guys in rubber suits, miniature buildings, model jets, and you'll even see like, what do they call those? Real markers are used in the game as like a way to show where an enemy is coming from. And it's got cutscenes that are all shot with actual humans. Like it's got real live action cutscenes. It's an incredibly cool shmup. Definitely worth checking out. It was announced for all major platforms, but so far it's only on Switch and PC. But yeah, this is a really unique game, and if you're a fan of vintage monster movies, not just Godzilla, but any of the vintage monster movies from like the 50s, this will be right up your alley. Now, in my first presentation, I covered pretty much all of the Gamera video games. In my second presentation, I covered pretty much all of the King Kong video games, as well as all the Pacific Rim video games. And I've also covered a decent number of Godzilla video games. So this time I really wanted to dig deep on Ultraman video games, because Ultraman is just getting bigger and bigger each year. I mean, every live-action Ultra series, barring a few, are now available to watch on like YouTube, Tubi, Blu-ray, DVD, whatever you want. It's super available, super accessible. It's growing in popularity each year. So let's dig into the video games. Now, one thing to note, unlike Gamera, King Kong, and even Godzilla, there are an insane number of Ultraman video games. So I'm not claiming to cover all of them. I'm going to try and hit the heavy hitters, but believe me, there is a lot. So we're going to go all the way back to the very beginning. The very first Ultraman video game is Fight Ultraman, and this is a pretty unique game. It's, but you know, the game itself is fairly simple. You just kind of move Ultraman around and shoot at Balton until the next level, and then do that again and again and again and again. It's from 1983. Games were a lot simpler back then. But what's really unique is you'll notice the platform listed is the RX-78, so the personal computer RX-78. Are there any anime fans here in the audience who recognize the RX-78 thing? What's that from? Gundam, Mobile Suit Gundam. So this is, I kid you not, a Mobile Suit Gundam personal computer that released in 1983. So the very first Ultraman video game was released on a Gundam computer. And so that's actually the same year that the original Famicom released in Japan. That was later released here 2 years later as the NES. Next, we got this early LCD game called Ultraman Monster Battle. It's very similar to a Game & Watch, if you've played a Game & Watch. The gameplay is really simple. It's basically kaiju whack-a-mole. But it's pretty cool because it's backlit. You can see there that unlike Game & Watch games where you have to actually play them in the sun and get the right angle, this is unique in that it's backlit. And it's got pretty cool art. Moving ahead here, we have just Ultraman, 1984. This is for the MSX computer. So this is a Japanese home computer. So far, these are all Japan-only games. And what's unique about this game is you actually start by playing as Shin Hayata in the VTOL. And once the VTOL crashes, just like in the show, then he transforms into Ultraman, and you can fight the kaiju more on equal terms. So it was really trying to emulate the look and feel of the original show, even back in 1984. Ultraman Counterattack of the Monster Empire. This is a Famicom Disk System game. This was an add-on for the Famicom that we never got. I would say this is kind of like a very simple Mega Man crossed with Ultraman. And this game was pretty popular and pretty available in Japan. Next is a series of games, so I'm just kind of lumping them all together, called Ultraman Club. And this kind of took the Ultras and the Kaiju and made them super deformed and cute, and put them in mostly role-playing games, but as you'll see here, it also put them in a platformer game, an arcade action game, and an Olympic sports game. So if you ever wanted an Olympic sports Ultraman game, there you go. And next, so this is probably the first major Ultraman game. It's just called Ultraman. It was Banpresto's first ever arcade game, and it released on multiple platforms. So it was on Super Famicom, which is the Super Nintendo for us, the Mega Drive, which is the Sega Genesis for us, arcade, Game Boy, WonderSwan, Color, and mobile phones. So the arcade version of this has some exclusive monsters. The WonderSwan version has some exclusive monsters. And the game itself is fairly simple. It's basically a single-player fighting game where you get to play as Ultraman, and you've got to fight the enemy monster until they're low health and then blast them with the Spacium Ray and move on to the next one. It is incredibly difficult. It sounds simple. It looks simple, but it's pretty tough. And you can see these are all the different versions from arcade, Super Famicom, Mega Drive, Game Boy, and WonderSwan. And the WonderSwan version is actually a remake that came out a full decade after the original version. But there's technically one more version of this game. So we didn't get this game, but it got reskinned and released in North America as Ultraman Towards the Future. So this is the same basic gameplay, but with the 90s series Ultraman Towards the Future that we actually aired on TV here. Thankfully, this game is much easier than the other Ultraman game. It's much more fun. It's still, it's not an amazing game, but it is pretty cool. The graphics are great. This was actually my first exposure to Ultraman as a kid. I had this on Super Nintendo. And yeah, this game I'd say is definitely worth checking out, especially if you're a fan of that original show. But it doesn't stop there. There were a few more of these kind of style of game. So in Japan, there was Ultraseven, which is very similar to those two previous games, but you play through Ultraseven. And it actually has sections where you get in a jet and kind of play through little shmup levels. You can summon the capsule kaiju like Miklas, Agira, and Wyndham. And it is also pretty tough. And then for this next game, which is kind of the last in this style of single-player fighting games, I got to talk about a machine called the Panasonic 3DO. So back in the 90s, we've got Sega, we've got Nintendo, we've got NEC and SNK. We've got the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the TurboGrafx, the Neo Geo. A lot of these consoles are coming out of the woodwork, and they're making a lot of money. So Panasonic looks around and it says, well, we can do that. We could make our own console. And what's interesting is they decide, instead of making it just themselves, they do it like a VCR. So you could buy a VCR from anyone. You can buy a Blu-ray player from any brand. It just has to be made to a certain specification. So they said, we're going to make a video game with better technology. You can use CDs with it, and you can buy it from multiple manufacturers. You can buy it from Panasonic, or I don't even remember who else manufactured it. This thing totally bombed. There was no Panasonic 3DO 2, though they had plans for one. But it did release in Japan, and that means that we got an Ultraman game for it. So this is Ultraman Powered, and this is based off the American-made Ultraman series that never released in America, but it did release in Japan. And what's really cool about this video game is this is a genuine tokusatsu game. So most times, video games, they try to emulate the look and feel of kaiju movies. This one, they said, let's get some guys in rubber suits and take pictures of them and turn it into a video game. So this is, genuinely, those are the guys in the actual suits from the show. And kind of like Mortal Kombat, they would digitize them and put them into the game. So really, really unique, really cool. But obviously kind of hard to find because not a lot of people have a 3DO, let alone a Japanese 3DO. And this game was developed by a company called Tosei. So Tosei is a kind of, I wouldn't say infamous, but a pretty important company because up until, I would say, about a decade ago, they would develop games what's called white label. So they wouldn't be credited on the box. They wouldn't say it was a Tosei game. Nintendo would hire Tosei, or Capcom would hire Tosei to make a game and kind of pass it off as a Nintendo or a Capcom game. So you can see here, these are some of the games that Tosei has worked on, but they were never credited on them, fully. So there's probably a lot of games you've played that were secretly made by this company that you don't even know. Now there's a full list, but back in the 90s, we had no idea. Yes, so we've got these Playdia games. So Bandai Playdia, it was a CD-based educational game system released in the 90s by Bandai, and there were a lot of Ultraman games released for it. I'm not going to cover them all, but they range from, Ultraseven Global Defense Tactics to Ultraman Let's Play with Numbers. So obviously the audience here is more early children, educational stuff, but what's neat about almost all of these games is they have original footage that they shot just for these video games. So there is footage of Ultraman and the Kaiju that is only on these Bandai Playdia video games. I have one of them. I think one of them is actually on sale in the dealer's room. I should probably record it and upload it somewhere so that, for posterity, but there you go. Then we have Ultraman Fighting Spirit Legend from 1993, and this is a really cute beat-em-up. It's an arcade game, and it was released by Banpresto. Now, the weird thing is this game never released here, but I visited a couple of arcades and barcades in Toronto and around that have these arcade machines that have like 800 arcade games on them. It is often in there, so if you're in an arcade that has one of those multi-cabs, you might find it. I played through the whole thing. It's pretty cute. Next is Ultraman Ball. So this is one of the weirder games. In this game, it's a 2D platformer for the Game Boy where you play as Ultraman, and just like in the show, he can wrap himself up into a ball and bounce around. To be fair, that did happen at least in Ultraman 80, but in no other show. So this game is actually really fun. Like in terms of games I would recommend from this presentation, this is absolutely one of them. It's got a almost Sonic the Hedgehog type of feel to it, but with a rubber ball, bouncy ball kind of mechanic. Someone speedrun this for Games Done Quick, that fundraiser event, so you can actually watch a speedrun of it online. He beat it in like 6 minutes. But what's really weird about this game is that obviously this was not originally supposed to be an Ultraman game. So there's this game called Armadillo that released on the Famicom, and it's about an armadillo that can roll up into a ball and bounce around. That seems a little more sensical to me than Ultraman, but, they were going to make a Game Boy version of this game. It got canceled, and instead they made Ultraman Ball. And that's something that happens a lot, where a game will start out being developed in one way, and they'll just put a franchise or an IP on top of it. Speaking of, this game is called PD Ultraman Invader. Has anyone here played Space Invaders? Yeah, this is exactly what this is, just with Ultraman and like a slightly different camera angle. So yeah, I mean, if you like Space Invaders and you like Ultraman, here you go. And here's another one. This is called PD Ultraman Link. Does anyone have any idea what this game may be based off of? Close, yeah? Close. It does look a lot like Dr. Mario. It is actually based off of Puyo Puyo. So if anyone here has played Puyo Puyo, also released here as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. This is essentially a slight variation on that with Ultraman characters for the Sega Saturn. Next, so as we all know, earlier this year we got to see the Shin Japan Heroes Universe project. It's a mouthful, where Kamen Rider, Ultraman, Godzilla, and AV Unit 01 are all together. And this must be the first time this has happened, right? Like Kamen Rider, Ultraman, and Godzilla in one thing. Except it's not, because it happened a long time ago. long before that came out. So the Compati Hero series is a long-running series of video games in Japan, and it includes 28, at least 28 games by my count, over 24 years. And the genres range from, the first game, I kid you not, was a sumo wrestling game. We've got baseball, we've got run-and-gun platformers, we've got beat-em-ups, RPGs, tactical RPGs, soccer, everything. They made so many of these games. Gundam is in every single game. Ultraman and Kamen Rider are in almost every single game. And Godzilla and Mazinger appear in a handful. Again, I'm not going to cover these all, but I want to go through the few that I think are definitely worth checking out. First one is SD, The Great Battle. This is kind of a top-down, kind of Zelda-like shooter. It's pretty neat. You can swap through Ultraman, Kamen Rider, and Gundam. And what's crazy is that this game was going to be released in North America. You can see there, that box art is for a Super Nintendo version of the game that was canceled around this, like this was canceled, and so was Godzilla Destroy All Monsters. So unfortunately, Bandai had stuff in the pipe that they just ended up not bringing over for whatever reason. But this game's pretty cool, and it's the first in a kind of sub-series. Famously, of course, Battle Soccer from 1992. This game is probably the most well-known of the Compati Hero series because it's got Godzilla in it. It's one of two games with Godzilla in it. So this is a soccer game where you can play as a Godzilla team, a Kamen Rider team, Gundam team, or an Ultraman team. I really like it because it has Titanosaurus in it, and that's my favorite kaiju. So, and it's reasonably fun, actually. It's not the best soccer game, but it's pretty fun. We've got Battle Baseball, so there's King Ghidorah at the bat. If you thought King Ghidorah was weird, see who's coming up next. Bylante. So this was actually released for the Famicom, even though it came out after Battle Soccer. And this is from Sims, who developed the Game Gear Godzilla game, which I've mentioned in a previous panel, and if you haven't played, highly recommend. There's an English patch. Then we get into the Great Battle sub-series some more. So this is Great Battle 3. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up, and this is where they introduced a new original character called Fighter Roar, and he would appear in the rest of the series of Great Battle games. So this game is again, it's pretty simple, but it's a lot of fun, and you can swap through the characters at any time. Then we've got Great Battle 4, which is, if you like Mega Man X, this is just Mega Man X with Kamen Rider, Ultraman, and Gundam, and giant robot boss battles. Kind of like Rocket Knight Adventures, if you've ever played that. Definitely recommend checking this game out. It's thankfully still not too expensive, but it gets up there. So these games are actually, in the retro gaming community, pretty famous because they were Japanese games you could import without having to know how to speak Japanese. And this is probably the most sought after and probably the most critically acclaimed of the Great Battle games. This is regularly ranked as one of the best import Super Nintendo games. The Great Battle 5 is one part Mega Man X type of game, side-scrolling run and gun, and one part kind of 2.5D, Cabal-style shooter. So you can see there he's kind of aiming into the distance to fight Dada. It's very much inspired by a Super Nintendo game called Wild Guns, if you've ever played that. Excellent game. This game even has a Wild West motif. So even though it's Ultraman and Kamen Rider, they're wearing cowboy hats and leather and all that kind of stuff. Really, really good game. Next, this is one that I've also mentioned before, and I'm just mentioning again. This is Ultra Keibital, or Ultra X Weapons. This is a shmup developed by Seta, who would go on to create Project Soulfeed for the Xbox 360. This game is awesome. It's really, really fun. And the reason I'm bringing it up here again is because it was made by, or published by Banpresto, and early this year, Banpresto said, we're going to start re-releasing our licensed games. And they released their Mazinger Z shmup on the Switch, PS4, and all that stuff. So I'm hoping that this game will get a re-release, and if it does, I definitely recommend checking it out. You can play as any of the original Ultramen. We actually play as the pilots in the ships, and you take on all the kaiju from the entire series. It's a great game. Next, this is a game where the game is not as interesting as much as how it was released. So SG, Ultra Battle, Ultraman, and Ultraseven, these are two separate games. And they're kind of like generic ho-hum beat-em-ups, if I'm being honest. But what's really neat about them is that they were released for this thing called the Sufami Turbo. So that device there, that would plug into a Super Nintendo. The reason that exists is because to make a Super Nintendo game, you had to pay Nintendo to make it. And Bandai was like, well, that costs a lot of money. Nintendo, can we just make a thing that plugs into the Super Nintendo and make our own cartridges that plug into that? And Nintendo was like, sure, I guess, as long as you make it. And they did. So this is a device that plugs into the Super Nintendo that can take two cartridges at once. And those cartridges were really cheap to produce, and that's why this was made. But what's really cool is those cartridges can interact with each other. So even though there was an Ultraman game and Ultraseven game, if you put them both in, you could swap characters across the two games. Next, this is one of the earliest really, tournament-style one-on-one fighting games, Ultraman Legend of the Giant of Light for the Sega Saturn. It's got a really interesting 2.5D art style. And this was one of two games that required the Sega Saturn's memory pack to be able to play, because it had a lot of animations and effects and things like that. It's really fun and pretty unique. It never got a sequel or anything, but definitely worth checking out. But it kind of got overshadowed by what would come next, and that's Ultraman Fighting Evolution. So this came out on the PlayStation 1 in 1998, and it started the Ultraman Fighting Evolution series, which I'm going to go through here. So this game was really popular. Thankfully, it's also pretty affordable. Like, it's one of those games, even though it's old, you don't have to break the bank to buy it. It got a sequel in 2002 with Ultraman Fighting Evolution 2. This game was also pretty cool, pretty exciting, but things really got kind of heating up with Ultraman Fighting Evolution 3. So as you can see, these games were pretty popular if they kept churning them out like this. Fighting Evolution 3 has the largest roster. I forget exactly how many it is, but it is a lot of Ultramen and a lot of Kaiju. And this is usually considered the best Ultraman fighting game. For some people, it's even considered just the best Ultraman game. It's a fighting game that's very similar to, Tekken, Dead or Alive, those kinds of fast-paced 3D fighting games. And it's got a cool story mode where you replay specific battles from each series. And it was followed up with Ultraman Fighting Evolution Rebirth. And this game has less characters, but they totally redid the battle system, the graphics, all that kind of stuff. And what's really interesting is this is where the video games started to impact the actual Ultraman television show and movies. So you'll notice there we've got Cosmos fighting a kind of scary-looking Gamora, and that's EX Gamora. You'll see here, this is EX Red King and EX Gamora, who appear in Ultra Galaxy. And those are both characters that were originally created for this video game. So they're actually, the whole concept of EX Monsters came from a video game and then moved on to become a concept in the TV show. And so did, if you've seen Ultra Galaxy Legends, the movie, it's actually just based on fully on a video game. So after Fighting Evolution Rebirth, we got the Ultra Galaxy series of games. These were arcade games where you would get trading cards that you could then play onto the machine to summon kaiju and fight other kaiju. And this was so popular in Japan that not only did it get like a Wii release of the game and multiple iterations of the arcade game, some of which are still going on to this day, it led them to create the TV show Ultra Galaxy Mega Monster Battle. So Ultra Galaxy Mega Monster Battle is actually an adaptation of a video game, which is kind of unique. And also like one of my favorite Ultra shows. It's great. If you like wrestling, it's just guys beating the tar out of each other in space. It's great. Then we get the final Ultraman Fighting Evolution game, which is Ultraman Fighting Evolution 0 for the PSP. This has Ultraman Mabius in it, which was the last kind of Tsuburaya Ultraman series before Bandai kind of bought out them. And what's cool about this is around this time in Japan, there was a manga called Ultraman Story 0 that was telling the origin of Ultraman and all the Ultras in the Land of Light. And this is a sort of tie-in to that. It kind of relates to the manga in that way. But that's not all. PlayStation has so many Ultraman games. We got Ultraman in 2004, and this is a fully 3D fighting game with a focus on single-player content, and it stays incredibly true to the original show. You can play versus with many of the kaiju from the original show, and some of them, this is their only playable experience. Like that's Skydon there, the super heavy kaiju that Ultraman can't lift. You can play as Skydon. There's no other game you can play as Skydon. He can barely walk, but you can play as him. It also includes a Return of Ultraman mode that plays through a lot of battles in that TV show. And it's the same developer as a game called DreamX TV World Fighters. You may or may not know that. It's like a fighting game that has Bomberman, Transformers, and Barbie in it. But they made one other game called Ultraman Nexus. And this, for my money, I think this may be the most fun Ultraman game on the PS2. It's a really slick, fast-paced fighting game, but it's also like a full-on action-adventure game. You play as the human from the series, and you run around and actually gun down monsters. And I mean, spoilers for a show from 2004, but if you die as the main human, you move to the next human, because in the show, Ultraman actually swaps hosts. He doesn't stay to one host. That's not much of a spoiler. If you haven't watched Ultraman Nexus, you should watch Ultraman Nexus. But yeah, really cool game, and this would have been the last PS2 game. Or I think, yeah, this would have been the last PS2 game, I'm pretty sure. Or maybe Rebirth. And then we've got Taiketsu Ultra Hero for the Game Boy Advance. What's unique about this is the only video game of Ultraman directly published by Nintendo themselves. I don't know why Nintendo thought this game specifically was the one they would publish, but they did. It's pretty cool. It's a 2D fighting game. There's a lot of 2D fighting games in the Ultraman series. And it's incredibly expensive to this day. I think that's because Nintendo published it and it didn't get a huge release. Again, Japan only. Now we're going to talk about some cursed Ultraman games. So I'm not going to get into the full details of the Chayo lawsuit, but basically there was a company from Thailand that claimed to own the Ultraman franchise based on some really sketchy material that they presented to courts in Japan, and unfortunately for the longest time those materials were honored. It wasn't until 2019 that Tsuburaya was able to win that court case, and that's why we have this glut of Ultraman content. That's why you can walk into Best Buy and buy Ultraman. But while Chayo had this license and was doing a lot of these shady, kind of illegal, unofficial, semi-unofficial Ultraman things, they did release 3 games. They were released in the US, believe it or not, Singapore and Thailand, and surprise, surprise, they are all pretty terrible. They were only released on PC. These are the kind of games that you would find in like a Staples bargain bin. But they exist, so I have to document them, and here they are. Now, the last Ultraman game to get released was Nari Kids Park Ultraman Rube in 2018. And this is as you can see from the video there, it's very much focused on young kids, and it's a kind of very simple mini-game kind of collection where you play as Ultraman Rube fighting kaiju, and you swing the Switch controllers around. It looks pretty cool. I don't have a copy of it. I do want to track one down and play it. But this would be it. I mean, the only other Ultra game is Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher, and that isn't technically an Ultraman game, though he does show up in it. So that would be it. Now, there are plenty of Ultraman games that I missed. Feel free to sound off and let me know. But I figured, that was pretty much 35 minutes straight of Ultraman. But what's on the horizon? Unfortunately, right now there isn't a lot. As we just found out, the port of Gigabash to the Nintendo Switch is coming out on August 3rd, you said? Yeah. And then there is an Xbox version. I don't think there's a release date for it, but once they finish the Switch version, they're going to be releasing it on Xbox. So that's coming out soon, which is really cool. Another one that maybe not a lot of people know about is Taito Milestones 2. So Taito Milestones is a collection of old Taito games, and the next volume of it comes out, I think, in September, and it includes Dino Rex, which I've talked about before. Dino Rex is like the weirdest, jankiest, dinosaur fighting game. You see him smashing through cities there, that giant Barney-looking dinosaur. This game is nuts, and it is included. And this is the first time this game has been released in a long time. So the other games in the Taito collection are really good too, but Dino Rex is important for our interests here. And then coming out, hopefully, end of this month, fingers crossed, the DLC for Dawn of the Monsters is coming out, the arcade edition, and that includes Meteor Temujin, which is a kind of Megazord-style character that can swap between weapons. So this was actually, there was a poll held on our social media channels about which character people would like to see in the DLC, and Meteor Temujin won the poll by, I wouldn't say a landslide, but pretty close to a landslide. So yeah, this should be launching in a couple of weeks. 13M Games social media will definitely announce it and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, there's actually paid DLC, and there's going to be a bunch of free DLC that comes with it as well. And then the only other kaiju game that we truly know of on the horizon is the mysterious Project GG. So this was revealed 3 years ago with a teaser trailer, and it is a kaiju game by Platinum Games. Platinum made Bayonetta, Vanquish, Metal Gear Rising, Nier Automata. They're a pretty big Japanese video game developer, and this is kind of their first self-published original game. We don't know much about it at all, except that it is heavily inspired by Ultraman. And the teaser features an Ultraman-type dude getting ready to fight a giant monster. So expectations are really high. Platinum is a really great developer. We haven't heard about it in 3 years, so who knows when it's coming out. We have really no clue. But they haven't said it's canceled yet, so fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Yeah, and I mean, that's all I've got for today. If you're looking for a place to learn about and talk about kaiju video games, there's a Facebook group called Kaiju and Tokusatsu Video Games. Definitely recommend checking that out. And I've also got my website and my YouTube channel. And thank you so much for attending the panel.